Hi everyone, so let's now look at a really important theory within economics and macroeconomics throughout your course, and that is the principle of the long run aggregate supply curve. Now there's different interpretations that we will look at in this lesson. Firstly, we've got the classical monetarists or supply side theorists' opinion on the long run aggregate supply curve, and then we've got the Keynesian viewpoints. We'll have a look at both of those, but to understand why these opinions and why these interpretations differ, we must understand the labour markets. We'll also take a look at that. Okay, so let's get stuck in, but let's firstly start by just reminding ourselves on what the short run aggregate supply curve showed us in the previous lesson, and that really was the fact that there was a major assumption being made within the short run aggregate supply curve, which assumed that firstly wages are fixed. Okay, so wages are fixed during that given period that the short run aggregate supply curve reflects, and that is likely to be a period of months rather than years. So that's a really important point to be aware of there. Okay, so firstly, let's take a look at the labour market. So if we just focus now on the labour market and we consider a contraction in aggregate demand in the economy. If there's a contraction in aggregate demand, what impact is that likely to have on the demand and supply of labour within an economy? Well, let's just put down our equilibrium wage rate here at W1 and E1, and that all corresponds with the demand curve for labour, which is D1. So this demand curve, of course, comes from firms. The supply of labour is the employees themselves and giving their time for money. Okay, so if there's a contraction in aggregate demand, we can therefore anticipate that demand for labour will also contract, and we can see that there. So that will mean that employment within the labour market will also contract, so we will see a reduction in employment and the wage rate will also contract. But crucially, the labour market clears in this instance. Okay, so the classical view was that the labour market will adjust, and those that wish to find work will do so at lower wage rates. And this was really based upon the theory of adaptive expectations. And the classical economists believe in adaptive expectations. That is, people realise that the economy is going through a bit of a bad time, and therefore they realise that they need to adapt their expectations and must accept lower real wages. Okay, so their wage rate drops and they still accept going to work and gaining that employment. Okay, and the labour market crucially clears. Now this is very different, however, from the Keynesian interpretation. So let's just come down here firstly and look at this. Right, so the Keynesian viewpoint, well, Keynes argued that wages were sticky. So workers wouldn't actually want to go to work for lower wage rates. And this leads to disequilibrium in the labour market, perhaps due to the impact on morale, motivation of actually enforcing a pay cut for your existing members of staff. It could also be due to minimum wages, Keynes argued, trade unions, and even unemployment benefits. So actually there may be some people who just opt to become unemployed because they can get sufficient benefits so that they can continue to survive, really, economically speaking. Right, so what does this mean? Well, it's likely to mean that actually the labour market, Keynes argued, would actually contract to such a point, and we can see that W1 is maintained at that wage rate. So the classical economists, they believe that we would actually be at W2, E2, but Keynes would argue that wages are sticky, so people would not want to actually work at lower wage rates They would not accept those lower wage rates because of that wage stickiness. And therefore, we would see a larger contraction in employment, from our original equilibrium to this point of disequilibrium. Okay, that leads to a corresponding employment level of just E3, which is obviously below that of E2. Okay, so this really is the crux of the matter here. Now, adaptive expectations, furthermore, when it comes to classical economists, in the longer term, classical economists believe that actually people would readapt and realign their expectations based upon these lower wages, and would actually offer their wage services, and the supply would actually increase of labour, so that people that want to actually gain meaningful employment can actually gain such employment. Okay, so what does this mean for the long run aggregate supply curve as a whole? So let's focus now on the classical economists' opinion of this. Let's just draw that out so we can get rid of wage and employment as well, and let's just put this down. So here we've got real GDP, of course, and here on our vertical axis we've got the price level. Well, for classical economists, they believe that we would actually reach a point of an LRAS curve which would look like so, and it would be perfectly inelastic. So they argued actually that anyone who wants to get a job at the given wage rate would be able to get a job. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. So classical economists would argue that wages and prices are flexible. Consequently, the long run aggregate supply curve is inelastic. In the long run, there can be no unemployment due to wage and labour market equilibrium. Okay, and therefore the labour market would self-correct, and people that actually want to find their own job would be able to actually find a new job, albeit at a lower wage rate. Okay, so the labour market would adjust, and therefore in the longer term, this point of full employment here, YF, would be maintained. Now, incidentally, it's just worth remembering that this point, any point on the classical economist LRAS curve, is almost the equivalent of an economy being at the edge of their own PPF, or production possibility curve, or boundary if you prefer. So this means that they are at a point where anyone that wants to actually find meaningful work can do so. Okay, as long as they accept that prevailing wage rate. So let's now look at the Keynesian view. So we've seen that wages are sticky, and this leads to disequilibrium in the labour market, perhaps due to the impact on morale, motivation, minimum wages, trade unions, and even unemployment benefits, as we've seen. So what does this mean for the Keynesian LRAS curve? Well, it means that in the long run, unemployment may persist due to wage stickiness, and we saw that unemployment in the labour market diagram just a moment ago. When there is mass unemployment, output can be increased without an increase in costs. Okay, so this is in effect telling us that there is going to be a difference in the elasticity of the actual long run aggregate supply curve. Here we can see it's perfectly inelastic. Near full employment YF, higher output leads to higher prices. So let's just put this up on the board and have a look at the Keynesian interpretation here. So as we draw that in, we can see that we reach a vertical point here, which again is perfectly inelastic, and I will call that YF. So that is the point where anyone who wants to find a job at a given wage rate can do so. Okay, but of course Keynes believed in this wage stickiness, and so therefore he did not believe in adaptive expectations. He believed that workers would not accept those lower wages for those reasons that we've looked at. Okay, now here we can see that along this point. So at any point along here, we have mass unemployment all the way to Y1 there. Now, what we can also see is if we reach Y2, the actual price level, the corresponding price level, if we put in P1 there, we can see the corresponding price level for Y2 is increasing. And why would this take place? Well, really, it's about the principle of resources being used up within a given economy. As resources become used up for one purpose as opposed to another, then you must incentivize people to actually come to work and pay them more and so on. And so it means that the actual costs will increase in the longer term. Okay. Right, so that's it. So those differing interpretations there. We'll have a look at these different diagrams within our equilibrium output model. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.